Welcome to our next segment. In this video, we're going to be looking at more 20th century movements in art. So we looked at early 20th century art, and we looked at such movements as Cubism, Fauvism, Expressionism, and all the characteristic painters' tools of expression were under question in the early 20th century, as we saw with those earlier forms or movements in the 20th century. Color was not always used to describe a setting or an artist's impression, but also to evoke a feeling and challenge the viewer. Perception was gently discarded or violently tilted for dramatic impact. Now we're going to start to see compositions that are forcefully altered in a very new and dynamic way. So what we're going to look at now are forms of abstraction, which become a feature of modern art. We see artists moving beyond traditional oil on canvas approaches to great art, and were inspired by collage technique or frottage techniques that were formerly regulated to children's art. Such fever and experimentation led Europeans to draw inspiration from African culture. Europeans were stimulated by African artists' ability to create works in geometric, even abstract terms, unafraid of a lack of conventional reality. This freedom of expression inspired Europeans to rethink traditional representations, sometimes by writing their thoughts down in artistic manifestos, which served as a call to arms for their movement, as we did see with some of these earlier movements. The Armory Show, named after the building in New York, where it was held, was mounted in 1913 to introduce Americans to the current trends in European art. Many contemporary artists, such as Duchamp, which we're going to be looking at in this segment, Picasso, which we looked at in our last segment, were showcased in America for the first time. The show also exhibited prominent American artists. The adventuresome spirit that epitomizes modern painting and architecture also characterizes modern sculpture. Artists use new materials such as plastic and new formats such as collages to create dynamic compositions. Artists also dangled in metal shapes from a ceiling called mobiles, which we'll look at much later. In the Dada movement, which we will explore in this video, artists saw and found objects and turning it into works of art. These ready-mades became works of art simply because the artist said they were. So one movement we're going to look at briefly is the photo succession. From 1902 through 1907, a photographer named Alfred Stieglitz created a gallery called 291. It was considered the most progressive gallery in the United States, and it showcased photographs as works of art, as well as other works besides this sort of avant-garde European painting and modern style that was popular. So this is a very famous photograph by Alfred Stieglitz called the Steerage, done in 1907. It's a photograve, which is a sort of process or technique in photography. After his 8-year-old daughter had finished school and he closed his Fifth Avenue art gallery for the summer, Stieglitz gathered his wife and their child, and they took an excursion to Europe as a family. They departed for Paris on May 14, 1907, aboard the first-class quarters of the fashionable ship Kaiser Wilhelm II. His wife looked forward to going on the trip and shopping and visiting her relatives in Germany, but Stieglitz was anything but enthusiastic about going on the actual ship. His marriage to his wife, who was very status conscious, had become particularly stressful, and he really did. Stieglitz felt out of place in this sort of company of his fellow upper class. So think about the Titanic and that movie in terms of how passengers were treated. You know, these upper class passengers were usually at the top of the ship and had nicer quarters, and then the steerage were down at the bottom of the ship and the quarters weren't as nice. And so Stieglitz in his photograph is sort of commenting or making this sort of commentary about this sort of idea of status and class. And he really felt out of place in the company of his fellow upper-class passengers. But it was precisely this discomfort among his peers that prompted him to take a photograph that would become one of the most important in the history of photography. In his 1942 account, How the Steerage Happened, Stieglitz recalls, "How I hated the atmosphere of the first class on the ship. One couldn't escape the nouveau riches." In his essay, written 35 years after he took the photograph, Stieglitz described how the steerage encapsulated his career's mission to elevate photography to a status of fine art by engaging the same dialogues around abstraction that preoccupied European avant-garde painters. A round straw hat, the funnel leading out, the stairwell leaning right, and the white drawbridge with its railings made of circular chain, white suspenders crossing on the back of a man in the steerage below, round shapes of iron machinery, a mast cutting into the sky, making a triangular shape. And so I'm obviously looking at the photograph, and these are things that he's commenting on in the composition. I stood spellbound for a while, looking and looking. Could I photograph what I felt? Looking and still looking. I saw shapes related to each other. I saw a picture of shapes, and underlying the feelings that I had about life. Spontaneously, I raced to the main stairway of the steamer, chased down to my cabin, he got his camera, raced back again, all out of breath, wondering whether the man with the straw hat had moved or not, if he had the picture I had wanted to take would no longer be the same. The relationship of shapes as I wanted them would have been disturbed and the picture lost. But the man was still there. He hadn't moved. The man with the crossed white suspenders showing his back to us hadn't moved either, and he was talking to the other man. And the woman with a child on her lap sitting on the floor hadn't moved. So with his account, Stieglitz argues, with the benefit of more than 3 decades of hindsight, that the steerage suggests that the photograph has more than just a documentary voice. So a documentary type of photograph is more of like that speaks to the truth to appearance of subjects. This idea that a photograph represented the truth, and in a lot of ways, sometimes it really doesn't. You also have to think, too, of this idea of truth to appearance of subjects that is, in a field of space with a narrowly defined slice of time. So, one of the things with a photograph and the still image is this sort of narrowly defined slice of time. So, rather, for Stieglitz, the steerage calls for a more complex, layered view of photography's essence than that can accommodate and convey abstraction. Indeed, later photographers would engage this project further in a direct dialogue with abstract expressionist painting, which we'll look at later. Stieglitz is often criticized for overlooking the subjects of his photograph in his essay, which has become the account of which the photograph is discussed in our histories. But in his account, The Steerage, Stieglitz also calls attention to one of the contradictions of photography, its ability to provide more than just an abstract interpretation, too. The Steerage is not only about the significant forms of shapes, forms, and textures, but it also conveys a message about its subjects, immigrants who were rejected at Ellis Island, or who were returning to their old country to see relatives, and perhaps to encourage others to return to the United States with them. So, one of the things, too, that that this photograph prompted was this idea of the ghastly conditions that a lot of the steerage passengers had to endure. As a reader of mass-marketed magazines, Stieglitz would have been familiar with the debates about immigration reform and the ghastly conditions to which passengers in steerage were subjected. Stieglitz's father had come to America in 1849 during a historic migration of about 1 million Germans to the United States between 1845 and 1855. His father became a wool trader and was so successful that he retired by the age of 48. By all accounts, Stieglitz's father exemplified the American dream that was just beyond the grasp of many of the subjects portrayed in the steerage. Moreover, investigative reporter Kellogg Durlin traveled undercover as Steerage in 1906 and wrote of it. I can and did more than once eat my plate of macaroni after I had picked out the worms, the water bugs, and on one occasion a hairpin. But why should these things ever be found in the food served to passengers who are paying $36 for their passage? Still, Stieglitz was conflicted about the issues of immigration. While he was sympathetic to the plight of aspiring new arrivals, Stieglitz was also opposed to admitting the uneducated and the marginal to the United States of America, despite his claims of sentiment for the downtrodden. Perhaps this may explain his preference to avoid addressing the subject of the steerage and to see the photograph not as a political statement, but a place for arguing the value of photography as fine art. So when you do look at this photograph, some things and conventions to Stieglitz's work. He photographed the world as he saw it. He did very a little arrangement and allowed people and events to make their own composition. Again, he was really interested in this idea of composition possibilities, especially with diagonals and lines acting as framing elements. And here you really see that with the diagonals and framing effect, with the ladder, the sails, the steam pipes, and so on. And so, a lot of his, because he was a gallery owner and exhibited European art, he was influenced by experimentation European painting. And so some people have actually compared his photograph to Cubist art. So I could have included this in sort of our responses to Cubism, perhaps. And so he does sort of allude or sort of point out this sort of cubist-like arrangement of shapes and tonal values in his photograph. All right, our next movement is Dada. And so Dada emerged during the brutality of World War I, which took place between 1914 and 18. A conflict that claimed the lives of 8 million military personnel and an estimated equal number of civilians. This unprecedented loss of human life was a result of trench warfare, technological advances in weaponry, communications, and transportation systems. For the disillusioned artists of the Dada movement, the war merely confirmed the degradation of social structure that led to such violence, corrupt and national politics, repressive social values, an unquestioning conformity of culture and thought. From 1916 until the mid-1920s, artists in Zurich, New York, Hanover, and Paris declared an all-out assault against not only conventional definitions of art, but on the rational thought itself. The beginnings of Dada, poet Tristan Tzara recalled, were not the beginning of art, but of disgust. This is a photograph from the book of the Dada Almanac, and it is sort of portraying different figures and perhaps artwork associated with this movement. The climax of Dada in Berlin in Germany happened at the International Dada Fair of 1920. The central symbol of which was an effigy of a German officer with the head of a pig that hung from the ceiling. So in this photograph, we see different figures associated with this fair. So I'm not going to read them, but they are in my lecture notes if you want to refer back. The role of visual art in Dada was pretty important. The aesthetics of their work were considered secondary to Dada artists, to the ideas it conveyed. For us, art is not an end in itself, wrote Dada poet Hugo Ball, but it is an opportunity for the truth, perception, and criticism of the times we live in. Dada's both embrace and critique modernity, imbuing their works with references to technologies, newspapers, films, advertisements that increasingly defined contemporary life. They were also experimental, provocatively re-imaging what art and art making could be. using unorthodox materials and chance-based procedures. They infused their work with a spontaneity and irreverence. Wielding scissors and glue, Dada artists were very innovative with collage and photo montage. Other artists explored games, experimental theater, and performances. And a central figure, Marcel Duchamp, declared common manufactured goods to be ready-made artworks, radically changing the notion of a work of art as something beautiful made by a technically skilled artist. And here is one of Duchamp's ready-mades, Fountain. It's probably one of his most famous works, done in 1917. After moving from Paris to New York in 1915, Marcel Duchamp became a founding member of the American Society of Independent Artists, a group dedicated to advancing the ideas of new art. For its exhibition in April 1917, Duchamp submitted under a fictitious name a urinal he had purchased in the showroom of J.L. Mott Ironworks. He turned the object on its side and placed it on a pedestal, undermining its utilitarian associations. He then signed it R. Mutt 1917 and named it Fountain. This piece inspired heated arguments among the Society's directors and was finally rejected an hour before the exhibition opened. Fountain is one of a group of objects that Duchamp called ready-mades, and you can see some others featured here. Works with which he challenged traditional notions of making and exhibiting art. Anonymously defending the work in the press, Duchamp claimed that he had created a new thought for that object. He rejected the assumption that art must be linked to the craft of the hand, and instead argued that a work of art should be primarily about the artist's idea, a contention that became one of the most far-reaching principles of 20th century art, influencing artists as diverse as Robert Rauschenberg, who we'll be looking at later, Bruce Newman, and Cindy Sherman, who was a very famous photographer. The original Fountain disappeared shortly after its creation, but in 1938 Duchamp began issuing subsequent versions of the piece, reinforcing his fundamental questioning of originality and authenticity. This is the fourth full-scale version fabricated in 1964. And here is the original Fountain, and this was photographed by Alfred Stieglitz and was displayed at the 291 Art Gallery. And this is where this was displayed at his gallery after the 1917 Society of Independent Artists exhibit. Stieglitz used a backdrop of the Warriors, which was a painting by Marsden Hartley, to photograph the urinal. And then you can also see you can see where he signed the R. Mutt signature. Right, our next movement is surrealism, which was one of the most important and subversive movements of the 20th century. Surrealism flourished particularly in the 1920s and 1930s and provided a radical alternative to the rational and formal qualities of Cubism. Unlike Dada, from in which many ways it sprang, it emphasized the positive rather than the negative and sort of nihilistic view of the world brought on by World War I. Access to the subconscious. Surrealism sought to access the subconscious and to translate this flow of thought into terms of art. Originally, it started as a literary movement. It was famously defined by the poet André Breton in the first manifesto of surrealism in 1924. So he stated that surrealism was a pure psychic autonomism by which it is intended to express either verbally or in writing the true function of thought, though dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason and outside all aesthetics or moral preoccupations. A number of distinct strands can be discerned in visual manifestations of surrealism. Artists such as Max Ernst and André Masson favored autonomism, in which conscious control is suppressed and the subconscious is allowed to take over. Conversely, Salvador Dali and René Magritte pursued a hallucinatory sense of super-reality in which the scene depicted made no real sense. A third variation was the juxtaposition of unrelated items, and this is the sort of one that we're going to be focusing on in this segment, setting up a startling unreality outside of normal reality. Common to all surrealistic enterprises was the post-Freudian desire to set free and explore the imagination and creative powers of the mind. This is one object that we're going to be looking at by Merritt Oppenheim. So surrealism was originally Paris-based. Its influence spread through a number of journals and international exhibitions. The most important example of the latter began the International Surrealist Exhibition at New Burlington Galleries in London, and the fantastic art Dada Surrealism at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, held both in 1936. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the center of surrealist activity transferred to New York, and by the end of the war, the movement had lost its coherence. It had retained a potent influence, however, clearly evident in aspects of abstract expressionism and various other artistic manifestations of the second half of the 20th century. So the story behind this very unusual object before you, which is an ordinary cup, spoon, and saucer wrapped in this gazelle fur, is very important in terms of this sort of idea of how art and art history really transcend and change. The 22-year-old Basel-born artist, Merritt Oppenheim, had been in Paris for 4 years, when one day she was at a cafe with Pablo Picasso and some other people. Oppenheim was wearing a brass bracelet covered in fur when Picasso and his friend, who were admiring it, proclaimed, "Almost anything can be covered in fur." As Oppenheim's tea grew cold, she jokingly asked the waiter for more fur. Inspiration struck. Oppenheim is said to have gone straight from the cafe to a store where she purchased the cup, saucer, and spoon used in this piece. This amusing story belies the importance of the object and the critical acclaim and public fascination that has elevated it to the point where it has become the definitive surrealist object, ultimately to Oppenheim's dismay, because it really did sort of put a damper on her career as an artist. Oppenheim's object was created at a moment when sculpted objects and assemblages had become prominent features of surrealist art practice. In 1937, British art critic Herbert Reed emphasized that all surrealist objects were representative of an idea, and Salvador Dali, whose painting you're probably very familiar with, and again is probably one of the most famous surrealist paintings, describes some of them as objects with symbolic function. In other words, how might an otherwise typical functioning object be modified so it represents something deeply personal and poetic? How might it, in Freudian terms, resonate as a sublimation of internal desire and aspiration? Such physical manifestations of our internal psyches were indicative of a surreality, or point in which external and internal realities united, as described by Andre Breton, who again was one of the surrealist founders and theorists, in his Manifesto of Surrealism. So I want you to look at this object and really think and consider what interpretations you might have when confronted with something like this. I mean, again, it is very different than, I think, really anything that we've looked at so far. So the art historian Whitney Chadwick has described this object as a link to the surrealist love of the alchemic transformations by turning cool, smooth ceramic and metal into something warm and bristly, while many other scholars have noted the fetish qualities of the fur-lined set, as the fur imbues these functions, handheld objects with these sexual fetish connotations. In a 1936 issue of the New Yorker magazine, it was reported that a woman fainted right in front of the fur-bearing cup and saucer while it was exhibited at the MoMA. She left no name with the attendant who revived her, only a vague feeling of apprehension. Such visceral reactions to Oppenheim's sculpture come closest, perhaps, to what was likely the artist's aspirations. In an interview later in life, Oppenheim described her creation as not as an illustration of an idea, but the thing itself. unlike Dali, Oppenheim stresses the physicality of the object, reinforcing what we can readily imagine, the feeling of the fur while drinking from a cup and using the saucer and spoon. And so this sort of visceral experience that we might have when China is unexpectedly wrapped in fur is based on our familiarity with both, and the fur requires us to extend our sensory experience to fully appreciate the work. So, object insists that we imagine what sipping warm tea from this cup feels like, how the bristles would feel upon our lips. When Oppenheim's elegant creation, with her elegant creation, we understand these visceral memories. How we can create metaphors and symbols out of this act of tactile extension is entirely open to interpretation by each individual, which in many ways is the whole point of surrealism itself. So, in spite of our individual response, the interpretation of object has been complicated by the way it was it was assigned meaning by others. When object was finished, Oppenheim submitted it to Brayton for an exhibition of surrealist objects at the Charles Raton Gallery in Paris in 1936. However, while Oppenheim preferred a non-descriptive title, Brayton took the liberty of titling the piece Les Déjeuners en Forêt, or Luncheon and Fur. The title is a play on the two 19th century works, Edward Manet's and famous modernist painting Luncheon on the Grass. And then also Les Paul von Sacher Message, which was an erotic novel entitled Venus in Fur. With these two references, Breton forces an explicit sexualized meaning onto object. Recall that the original inscription of the work was implicitly practical, so just object. When Oppenheim asked the waiter for more fur for cooling her teacup, it was suggested as a way to keep her tea warm, and not necessarily as an overtly sexual reference. So, leave it up to a man to sort of take this and, turn it into something fetish and sexual. And because of this, it did have sort of repercussions on her career. This is another sort of object or this idea of an object, a pair of brown shoes attached to the toe that she played with. Art historian Edward Powers has noted that when Oppenheim sent her surrealist object, Das Pair, which is a pair of brown shoes here that you see, to a photographer before submitting it for the exhibition, the photographer took the liberty of tying up the laces before photographing it. When Brayton saw the photo with tied laces, he dubbed the object à délacer, which in French means to untie, typically either shoes or a corset. The title and laced shoes together suggest the potential act of undressing and a fascination with exposing the female body. However, when Oppenheim later described Das Pair with the laces untied, she stated it was an odd unisex pair, two shoes, unobserved at night, doing forbidden things. She expressly assigned no gender and suggests the forbidden acts already taken place between the anthropomorphized shoes. She takes a more literal approach, the shoes as an expressive thing in themselves rather than symbolically resonant of something else. And this is another photograph she took. So this isn't suggesting that all her interactions with Breton were negative. It kind of seems like that. It seems like he was taking a lot of her work and sexualizing it. When she happened across a wonderful, disturbing photograph of a bicycle seat covered in bees, she mailed it to Breton, who republished the found photograph as an artistic contribution by Oppenheim in the third issue of the new surrealist publication Medium. The early acclaim for the fur-covered object had a negative effect on Oppenheim's early career. When it was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art and featured in their influential 1936-37 exhibition of fantastic art, Dada and surrealism, visitors declared it quintessential, the quintessential surrealist object, in that And that is how it has been ever since. But for Oppenheim, the prestige and focus on this one object proved too much, and she spent more than a decade out of the artistic limelight, destroying much of the work she produced during that period. It was only later, when she reemerged and began publicly showing new paintings and objects with renewed vigor and confidence, that she began to reclaim some of the intent of her work. When she was given an award from her work by the city of Basel, she touched upon this in her acceptance speech. "I think it is the duty of a woman to lead a life that expresses her disbelief in the validity of the taboos that have been imposed upon her kind for thousands of years. Nobody will give you freedom. You have to take it." So I'm going to stop here, and we'll continue our exploration in the movement of surrealism in part 2 of our lecture, so stay tuned.